A millionaire saw his former maid sleeping on the street. What he did next left everyone speechless. Snow was gently falling over the city, covering buildings and streets in a quiet, icy stillness. It was one of those evenings when even the wealthiest hurried indoors, shielding themselves from the biting cold. But on a forgotten park bench near the edge of the financial district, a woman in a navy uniform sat slumped, nearly blending into the frost gathering on her apron. That woman was Grace. For the last 3 years, Grace had worked in the grand home of Charles Whitaker, a man known more for his wealth than his warmth. His routines were precise, his expectations demanding, and his attention to the people around him, especially those who worked for him, was nearly non-existent. Grace was the kind of employee who went unnoticed. She was always on time, never spoke more than needed, and made sure the fireplace was lit every morning before Charles came down. To him, she was reliable and silent, little more than background noise in his perfect home. He never asked about her life outside the marble walls of his mansion. He never wondered where she went when her shift ended. So when Grace arrived 5 minutes late last Friday, eyes red, hands slightly shaking, Charles didn't ask a single question. He simply said, "You're dismissed," and turned away. No thank you, no severance, no reference letter. Just like that, she was gone. Grace didn't argue. She only nodded and walked away from the only warmth she had known in months. What Charles didn't realize was that Grace had been secretly sleeping in the laundry room of his estate. Ever since her mother fell gravely ill back in Louisiana, Grace had been sending home every cent she earned. Between rising rents and reduced work hours, she could no longer afford a place of her own. So she scrubbed his floors by day and curled up behind the dryer by night. When Charles let her go, she didn't even have money for a bus ride. That night, wearing the same thin uniform and shoes, Grace wandered the streets. The shelters were full. Train stations were no safer. Her phone had long since died. Exhausted, she sat down on a bench just to rest her eyes for a bit. But the cold was relentless. By morning, her fingers were numb, her breath barely visible. Charles Whitaker rarely walked to his meetings, but that day his driver was delayed. Impatient and needing to reach a boardroom across town, he decided to walk through a small park to save time. The snow crunched beneath his designer shoes. That's when he saw her. At first, he didn't recognize the figure slouched on the bench. Her head was drooped forward, her lips slightly parted, and her arms folded tight against her chest. Her uniform, his uniform, was dusted with snow. He took a step closer, then froze. "Grace?" he said, confused. She didn't move. He knelt down quickly, placing a hand on her shoulder, and recoiled at how cold she felt. "Grace?" he repeated, louder now, shaking her gently. Nothing. Charles looked around. The park was empty. The city hadn't fully awakened yet. A strange feeling rose in his chest. Not irritation, not worry over missed meetings, but something raw and unfamiliar. With trembling hands, he pulled out his phone and called for emergency help. As he waited, crouched beside the woman who had served him so quietly for years, he stared at her face. And for the first time, he really saw her. Her skin was coated in frost, her clothes soaked through, thin and no match for the cold. Her headband sat crookedly on her head. She looked small, frail, as though life had been heavy on her for a long time, and he had simply never noticed. As sirens wailed closer, Charles remained by her side, gently brushing snow off her arm with an unsteady hand. He didn't care that his tailored suit was now wet and cold. For once, his thoughts weren't occupied with stocks, deals, or boardrooms. His mind was filled with images of her, the woman who brought his tea each morning at 6, who folded his shirts with perfect care, the one he let go without asking a single question. He remembered once catching her smile at the spring flowers blooming outside the kitchen window, but that was all. He realized then how little he'd truly known her. When the ambulance arrived, Charles helped lift her onto the stretcher. As the doors closed, he followed, not as her boss, but as a man finally confronting the damage of his indifference. That realization cracked something deep within him. He had built massive companies, but he'd failed to see a human being quietly suffering under his own roof. Under the cold fluorescent lights of the emergency room, Charles sat in silence, hands clenched in his lap. His jaw tightened as he glanced at Grace, unconscious in the hospital bed, her face pale, an oxygen mask covering her mouth, IV lines in her arm. A nurse had described her condition as severe hypothermia. "Another hour out there," she'd said, "and we wouldn't be treating her. We'd be preparing a death report." Charles couldn't respond. His mind, always sharp and controlled, now spun with guilt and disbelief. He had known Grace, or thought he had, for 3 years. But the woman lying there wasn't just his maid. She was a person who had struggled silently, living inside his mansion, but barely surviving. The machines around her beeped rhythmically. Nurses moved in and out. Still, Charles didn't budge. His expensive coat was soaked. His phone buzzed endlessly. Calls from his board, messages from his assistant, even a concerned text from his daughter. "Are you having a breakdown?" He wasn't. He was finally waking up. Around midnight, Grace stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, her lips dry and cracked as she tried to speak. Charles leaned forward, holding his breath. "Grace," he whispered. She turned her head slowly, confused. "Am I dead?" A hollow chuckle escaped him, but it held no humor. "No, you're alive. You're safe now." Her gaze narrowed as it landed on him. She looked frightened. "Why are you here?" He swallowed, heart heavy. "Because I should have been here long before now." Tears formed in the corners of her eyes, and she turned her head away. "I didn't steal. I didn't lie. I was never late until that day." "I know," he said softly. "And I never asked why. That failure is mine, not yours." She said nothing more, and he didn't leave her side. The next morning, Charles returned home with a new purpose. He called his entire household staff, cooks, drivers, cleaners, gardeners, and told them the truth. No excuses, no carefully worded explanations. "I fired someone without ever understanding her story," he said, "and it almost killed her." The room fell silent. Some looked down in discomfort. One woman quietly began to cry. Then, to their astonishment, Charles Whitaker said something he'd never said in all his years at the top of the corporate world. "I'm sorry." Word spread fast. So did a photo of Grace, curled up asleep on that snow-covered bench, snapped by a jogger who had no idea who she was. The image went viral. People online were outraged. How could a millionaire allow this to happen to someone who worked for him? Reporters gathered outside the hospital. Cameras flashed. Questions flew. Charles didn't issue a formal statement. All he said was, "I've got more work to do than talking." And he meant it. When Grace was finally discharged, a sleek black town car waited outside, not to return her to her old job, but to offer something entirely different. Standing beside it, dressed in a crisp navy suit, Charles held out a warm coat and scarf. "This isn't charity," he told her softly. "It's something I should have done long ago. It's a correction." Grace hesitated. Her pride still stood tall, even when her body felt weak. She didn't want to accept help, but the hospital bills alone would have crushed her. Charles gently insisted, "Stay in the guest wing, not as a maid, just to rest, to heal. And when you're ready, we'll talk about what you want, not what I expect." Eventually, she agreed. Over the next few weeks, Grace slowly recovered. She stayed in a warm, sunny guest room, the first peaceful space she'd had in a long time. A private doctor checked in regularly. Quietly, without fanfare, Charles arranged for her mother and brother to be flown in from Louisiana. He rented an apartment nearby for them, placed in their name. Every evening, Charles visited, not as an employer, but as a man relearning how to be human. Over cups of tea, they talked. Grace shared stories about her childhood, her hometown, and the dreams she had once put aside just to survive, and for the first time, Charles really listened. Then one morning, he made a decision. He offered her a new role, Director of Staff and Employee Welfare, across all his properties, a salaried position, complete with benefits, authority, and a clear mission to ensure no one else ever went unnoticed the way she had. Grace blinked. "You trust me with that?" Charles met her eyes. "I've never trusted anyone more." Months later, at a grand charity gala held in the ballroom of his mansion, Charles stood behind the microphone. The crowd, dressed in glitter and silk, fell silent. "I spent years building towers and calling it success," he said. "But the real strength I've come to admire came from a woman who showed up every day to serve, even when life gave her nothing in return. I didn't see her then, but I do now." He turned and introduced Grace. Wearing a simple navy dress and her hair braided neatly back, Grace stepped onto the stage. The same room that once looked past her now stood in unison, not out of sympathy, but respect, admiration. The maid they had once ignored was now the woman who changed everything, and the man who once overlooked her, he finally found redemption, not through money or power, but by opening his eyes to the person he had never truly seen.